Out on the far edge of the Arizona territory, where the land burned red at sunset and the wind carried more secrets than sound, there stood a single cabin. No town nearby. No neighbors. Just a woman, a horse, and a stretch of country most folks called cursed. Her name was Mara Ellison. If you rode west from Fort Lowell until the soldiers' courage ran out, you'd find her there, hauling water from the well, talking to herself in the desert as if both could answer. Mara wasn't old, but grief had put years on her face that the calendar hadn't. 3 winters ago the fever took her husband, James. After he died, everyone said she should sell the land, come back east, marry again, live proper. Instead, she stayed. James had cut every board of that cabin with his own hands. Leaving it felt like burying him twice. So Mara stayed and learned to speak the language of wind against the clapboards, and the creak of saddles, and the way coyotes sang when something was dying out there in the dark. That's why, on that particular evening, she heard the trouble before she saw it. Hoofbeats. Not the lazy, wandering rhythm of a cowboy. This was uneven, staggering, like the horse was as hurt as the rider. She set down the water bucket beside the well and straightened, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The sun was almost gone, painting the canyon walls in molten red. Beyond the cabin, past the little corral, the land dipped into a shallow wash and climbed again toward the jagged mesa line. The rider appeared right where the mesa cut the sky. At first she thought it was a soldier, the way the figure drooped in the saddle. Then the horse came closer. The horse was painted. And the man's hair was long, bound with rawhide and feathers, his bare chest marked with earth pigments and blood. An Apache warrior. Alone. Wounded. Mara's breath caught. Every story she'd been told in town came rushing back at once: raids, scalps, burning homesteads, ambushes in the dark. Mothers whispering warnings to their children, don't stray too far. Don't trust the Apache. They're shadows with knives. But the man in front of her wasn't a shadow. He was all too real, and he was bleeding badly. The horse stumbled to a stop near the twisted juniper by her well. The rider slid sideways, caught himself with one hand on the saddle, then half fell to the ground. He landed on one knee, the other leg splayed, breathing hard. An arrow shaft jutted from just under his ribs, snapped off close to the skin. Blood soaked his side and mixed with dust on his hands. He lifted his head and looked at her. No hatred. No wild rage. Just pain. And something like curiosity. Mara realized her hands were trembling. She could feel the rough grain of the bucket handle under her fingers. She could turn, right now, run inside, bar the door, pretend she never saw him. No one would blame her. But she remembered another man on a bed, 3 winters ago. James, gasping for air, eyes glassy, begging for water between fevered prayers. She'd held the cup to his lips while the doctor shook his head in the corner. She'd promised herself then, if she ever stood between a living soul and death, and help was in her hands, she would not turn away. Not again. Easy, she whispered, more to herself than to him. She picked up the bucket and started walking. The Apache watched her come, his eyes tracking every step. He reached for the knife at his belt, then hesitated. His fingers fell away from the handle. He was too tired to threaten anyone. Mara knelt in front of him, close enough to smell blood and sweat and the dry metal tang of the desert dust baked on his skin. Up close, he didn't look like a savage from a poster. He looked like a man who'd seen too much of the world and bled for all of it. She tilted the bucket. Clear, cool water sloshed to the rim. "Drink," she said softly. He didn't know the word, but he knew the gesture. His hands shook as he wrapped them around hers and brought the bucket to his lips. He drank like a man who'd been walking through hell. Water spilled down his chin, ran in streaks through the pigments painted across his chest. He coughed once, then drank again, slower this time. When he'd had his fill, he pulled back slightly, breathing hard. His eyes never left her face. He tapped his chest with 2 fingers. "Taklisha," he said, hoarse. His name. Mara swallowed. Mara. She mirrored the gesture, palm against her own chest. Mara Ellison. Taklisha's gaze flickered. It was a small nod, but it carried the weight of recognition. Then his body sagged. The arrow wound was pulling him down. His eyes rolled, and he slumped sideways. "Wait!" Mara grabbed him, straining with all her strength, catching his shoulders before his head struck the hard-packed earth. He was solid, heavy with muscle and the lead weight of exhaustion. She looked at the cabin door, then back at him. Bringing an Apache warrior inside her home went against everything she'd heard, everything she'd been taught. It meant if soldiers came by and found him, they'd call her a traitor. It meant if his own people saw him here, they might think she'd captured or harmed him. Or they might think something worse. But leaving him out here meant he would die. Alone, in the dirt, like a broken animal. She'd watched someone she loved die that way already. She couldn't do it again. "All right, Mara Ellison," she muttered to herself, as she gripped him under the arms and started dragging. "You've finally gone mad." It took 3 trips. First to clear the table and bed inside. Then to tug his weight inch by inch over the threshold, boots scraping the floor. By the time she got him to the bed, sweat glued her dress to her back and her arms shook like jelly. She cut away the cloth around the wound with James's old knife. The arrowhead was still inside, lodged deep near his ribs. The flesh around it was hot and angry. She'd helped the doctor pull bullets from cowboys before. It wasn't so different, except this was Apache, and she was alone. "Don't you dare die after I've hauled you this far," she said through clenched teeth. She boiled water. She poured whiskey over the wound. She whispered apologies that he couldn't understand and that the fire in his nerves probably drowned out. When she worked the arrowhead free with the tip of a heated knife, his body went rigid and he let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream, but close. Then he went limp. For one long, terrible moment, Mara thought she'd killed him. She pressed a hand over the wound. There was still breath in his chest, shallow but steady. Blood still moved, but not in a pumping rush. She sewed the wound closed with shaking fingers, using thread she'd saved for mending clothes. Night came fully while she worked. The desert cooled, the sky outside turning velvet black awash in stars. Coyotes cried in the distance, but the sound felt far away, as if the cabin were floating in its own little island of lamplight and heartbeats. Mara sat beside the bed and listened to his breathing. At some point she dozed, chin dropping to her chest, the soft crackle of the oil lamp and his slow inhale-exhale lulling her into a shallow, twitching sleep. She woke to movement. The lamp had burned low, the room dim. Shadows pooled at the corners. Taklisha was sitting up, one hand braced on the bed frame, the other pressed to his bandaged side. His eyes glittered in the half-light. Mara jerked upright, heart hammering. "Easy. Easy. You'll tear the stitches." He regarded her for a long moment, studying her face the way one might study a new trail, wary, searching, mapping danger and possibility. Then he motioned toward the door. Mara frowned. "You're not going anywhere. You'll bleed out." He shook his head. The movement was small, but stubborn. He pointed to himself. Then to the door. Then he raised his hand, fingers spread wide, and slowly closed it into a fist, a gesture that carried the weight of urgency she didn't need words to understand. Something, or someone, was coming. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, teeth clenched against the pane. Mara moved to support him, but he shook her off gently. Pride, even on shaky legs. He reached into a small leather pouch that still clung to his belt and pulled out a short, carved whistle. He stepped to the open doorway, raised it to his lips, and blew. The sound was soft, almost too high to hear, like a coyote's cry carried miles away. Then it was gone. He tucked the whistle away and swayed. Mara grabbed his arm before he toppled. "All right," she muttered, "you've made your mysterious noise. Now you're going back to bed." To her mild surprise, he didn't argue. He let her guide him back, moved the blanket up over his chest. For a moment they were close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the scar above his brow, the way his jaw tightened each time a spark of pain shot through him. "Taklisha," she said quietly. "If soldiers come, I can't protect you." His gaze flicked to hers. He understood more than she expected. Slowly, he lifted his hand and placed it over hers where it rested on the blanket. His palm was calloused, warm. He looked at her as if to say, "You gave water to a man dying in the dust. That is protection enough." Words failed them both, so they stayed where they were for a heartbeat longer than necessary, a fragile thread of understanding stretching between worlds that weren't meant to touch. Then he let go and closed his eyes. Outside, the desert stirred. Morning came with a sky the color of cooled ashes and a wind that smelled like distant rain. Mara stepped outside to feed the horse and stoke the fire in the pit. That's when she felt it. Not heard. Felt. A low tremor under the soles of her boots, like the earth itself was holding its breath. Hoofbeats. Not one horse this time. Many. She shaded her eyes with one hand and looked to the ridge where last night's sun had burned the sky red. They came over it in a wave. Riders. Dozens of them. Horses painted in patterns of white and black and ochre, feathers whipping in the wind, lances catching the early light. Men with long hair and painted faces. One or two women among them, braids flying, eyes hard as flint. Apache. Mara's throat went dry. There were at least 60 of them. They rode in tight formation down the slope, the sound of hooves swelling until it filled the valley like a storm. They did not gallop wildly. They moved with deliberate, controlled power, like a single living creature with many hearts. Mara's first instinct was to run for the cabin, bolt the door, hide. But the door wouldn't stop them. And running would smell like fear. So she stood her ground beside the well, fingers curling against her skirts to keep them from shaking. The riders slowed as they neared the cabin. In a single, fluid motion, they fanned out in a wide half-circle, horse heads all turned toward Mara. Dust hung in the air, golden in the slanting light. For a few heavy seconds, no one moved. Then one horse stepped forward. Taklisha. He rode with his back straight despite the bandaged wound under his ribs. His face was painted fresh, red and white markings framing eyes that watched her closely. He said a few words in Apache, his voice steady. The riders' gazes shifted to Mara. She stood very still. Taklisha dismounted slowly, favoring his side only slightly. He approached her with the calm of someone who had decided already what this moment meant. He tapped his chest again. "Taklisha," he said. Then he gestured to the circle of warriors behind him, speaking in his language, his tone formal, almost ceremonial. Names rolled from his tongue like the river that carved the canyons, each with weight, each with history. Mara didn't understand the words. But she understood the way the other writers bowed their heads when he spoke, the way their eyes softened a fraction when they looked at her. Finally, he turned back to her and mimed lifting the bucket, drinking. He pressed a palm to his heart, then opened it toward her. "He's telling them," Mara murmured, more to herself than anyone. "About the water." An older Apache rider, braided hair streaked heavily with gray, stepped forward. Around his neck hung a necklace of bones and turquoise. His face bore the quiet authority of a man used to being obeyed. He studied Mara, his gaze moving from her hands to her eyes, to the cabin, then to Taklisha's bandaged side. Then he gave a single, solemn nod. Two younger riders dismounted and moved to the rear of the column. They lifted something heavy wrapped in a buffalo hide and carried it forward with great care, setting it on the ground between Mara and Taklisha. Taklisha knelt, even though Mara could see the flash of pain that crossed his face when he did. He pulled back the buffalo hide. Mara's breath caught. Inside was wealth. Not Eastern banknotes or coins, but wealth of a kind deeper than any ledger. Fine tanned hides, soft and supple. Carefully woven baskets filled with dried corn and beans. A bundle of herbs, sage, sweetgrass, and others she didn't know. A necklace strung with silver discs and pieces of turquoise that gleamed like bits of sky. And in the very center, wrapped in reddish cloth, lay a long object. Taklisha unwrapped it slowly, reverently. It was a rifle. Not the rough, standard-issue kind the army carried, but a custom piece. The stock was polished dark wood, carved with Apache symbols. The metal gleamed with careful oiling, etched with patterns like flowing water and rising sun. Mara swallowed. I don't understand." Taklisha lifted the rifle with both hands and held it out to her, but first, as if offering it to a chieftain. She hesitated, looking from the weapon to his face. "Why?" she whispered. He didn't answer in words. He pointed to his chest, then to the bed inside the cabin. Then to the well. Then, finally, to her heart. She'd given him water and life. In return, he was giving her something no one else in this part of the country had. Not just a weapon. A mark. A sign that she was under Apache protection. The older rider stepped closer and spoke in halting English, the words thick but clear. "Woman give life when death come," he said. "Apache, do not forget." His gaze hardened a fraction as he added, "This gift, no man refuse. No soldier. No outlaw. No one who wished to keep his scalp on his head." He pointed at the rifle, then to the valley around them. "You hold this," he said. "You show this. You speak name Taklisha, and they know this land, this woman, under our eye." Mara's hands shook as she reached out and took the rifle. It was heavy, solid, warmer than she expected. The carvings along the stock pressed against her palms like the ridges of a promise. She looked at Taklisha. You're giving me protection." He tilted his head slightly, listening to the word. Then he nodded. "Yes," he said carefully, shaping the foreign syllables. "Protection." Her throat tightened. For 3 years she'd lived with the low burn of fear in the back of her mind, too stubborn to leave, too proud to admit she was alone. Now 60 Apache warriors had ridden to her door to tell the world, she is not alone. What do you say to that? Thank you felt too small. Still, she said it. Thank you, Taklisha. He held her gaze, something softer flickering in his eyes for a moment. Respect, yes. Gratitude. And beneath that, something that made her suddenly aware of how close they were standing, how the morning light brushed his features in warm gold, how the breeze carried the faint scent of sage between them. He spoke in Apache again, low, almost gentle. She didn't know the words, but the tone curled around something in her chest and pulled. The older rider chuckled under his breath as if he understood more than he let on. Slowly, the Apache mounted their horses again. One by one, they turned their animals toward the open land. Taklisha was the last to mount. He looked down at her from the saddle, the wind tugging at the feathers in his hair. He touched 2 fingers to his forehead, then flicked them outward in a small salute. Not a soldier's crisp movement, but something older, more grounded. Mara lifted her free hand, surprised by the sting of tears in her eyes. "Right safe," she said, knowing he wouldn't understand the words but hoping he'd understand the wish. He clicked his tongue, and the horse moved. The Apache riders flowed away like a dark river, hooves drumming the earth. In minutes they were small shapes against the rising mesa, then silhouettes, then gone altogether. Silence returned, broken only by the creak of the well rope in the morning breeze. Mara stood alone beside the cabin again, the rifle in her hands, the buffalo hide bundle at her feet. Only, she didn't feel alone. Not anymore. The land looked different somehow. Not less dangerous, but less indifferent. She turned the rifle over in her hands, tracing the carved symbols with her thumb. The weight of it settled into her like a second spine. She knew, as sure as she knew the sun would track across the sky and vanish behind the mesa tonight, that word would travel. Soldiers would hear that a white woman out near the Red Wash had Apache riders at her back. Outlaws would hear it too. Most men with any sense at all wouldn't test a gift like that. Because in this country, there were some things you might gamble with: weather, cards, whiskey. But there was one thing no one with a lick of sense ever refused: Apache protection. Mara looked to the distant ridge where she'd last seen Taklisha's horse crest the horizon. She wondered when, not if, she would see him again. The desert wind rose, carrying dust and the faint echo of hooves long gone. She smiled, just a little, the first real smile in a long time. "All right, James," she murmured, glancing up at the sky. "Looks like I've got company now." Out here, at the ragged edge of the world, life and death still came on horseback. But so, it seemed, did Grace. Yeehaw, partners! Saddle up for more untold tales of the Wild West. Smash the like, subscribe, and share button to keep the frontier alive.